And I am Peter Askim. I'm the artistic director of the Next Festival of Emerging Artists. And this is a festival that we started 8 years ago as a physical festival. Remember, back in the day, we used to actually be in the same room together. And this is a festival designed to help artists at the beginning of their careers. So we started out with musicians, performers, and then added some composers into the mix. And then several years ago, we started a partnership with the Center for Ballet and the Arts at NYU, a fantastic resource. They kind of hooked me up with Christopher D'Amboise, a choreographer and great educator. And together we came up with a plan to a great social experiment. What happens if we give dancers and choreographers and performers and composers resources and time in the studio and just let them run wild? So we were really interested in seeing what are the different ways of collaboration between our fields. So music and dance are very similar and in some ways very, very different. The languages that we speak, we have similar words, but they mean different things to different people. So we were really interested to see, is it possible to actually really collaborate? Often a composer will write a score and the choreographer will set dance to it, or the other way around, but is it possible to actually have a dialogue from the beginning in real time? And what we found is that each composer choreographer pair has had a interesting solution to that problem, and very innovative work has come out of it. Our only requirement of the pairs that we pair up is that there's no final performance. We are really there to encourage collaboration and experimentation and failure on a massive scale. That is our goal. And so once this pandemic hit, we thought that we wanted to step into the void right away and provide resources and community and support for all of our family. So our audiences, our artists, our choreographers, our performers, our composers. So we've started an initiative called Next Fest Connects. And we've been doing twice weekly sessions on lots of different topics, like how to navigate careers in times of change, how to collaborate with electronics, how to create effective videos on your own. And so we invite you to join us. We're doing these twice weekly, and for the duration, we're here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you're here, you know how you got here, and you can get here again. And we invite you back. And I would like to just welcome you all to this and want to introduce you to somebody who's been a really fantastic partner of ours developing this. So we introduced James and Gabrielle in 2018. They were paired as a composer-choreographer pair and have gone on to collaborate on some fantastic projects under the auspices of the CUNY Dance Initiative. And so I wanted to introduce Alisa Alpine from CUNY Dance Initiative to tell you a little bit about her organization and their role in the collaboration that James and Gabrielle have had. Again, welcome. So glad you're here, and I will turn it over to Alisa now.
Thank you, Peter. For those of you who are coming from the music world or outside of New York, I wanted to just speak a little bit about the organization that I run, which is the CUNY Dance Initiative. We are a residency program for New York City choreographers on CUNY campuses. CUNY is the city of New York, City University of New York. We work with 13 campuses across the 5 boroughs, and we're in our 6th year right now. Like most arts and cultural organizations across the country right now, we're on hiatus for physical activities, and we're doing everything that we can remotely. So over the course of our 6 years, we've supported about 140 choreographers, and Gabrielle has been in residence with us 3 times now. And the most recent performance and residency that we supported was this project that has been in the works for, I would say, a very solid year. And James and Gabrielle are going to tell you a lot more about it, but I can say from our side, it was very special because it was our first official formal choreographer and composer commission. It means we were able to pay more than we normally have, to put it really bluntly. and to give the project, I think, the resources that it deserved. And that played out in many, many ways that I think they can articulate better than I can. I do want to say a special thank you to the O'Donnell Green Music and Dance Foundation. They were the lead commissioner for this project. They took a leap of faith on us and these artists, and I think it really paid off for this February premiere that was actually one of our last shows before the world shut down. So James and Gabrielle can tell you about it. I'm happy to answer more questions about the CUNY Dance Initiative, about the support we give artists, etc. Our website, which I will put in the chat, has a ton of information about us and the artists we've worked with. Thank you.
Hi, I guess I'll start. I'm Gabrielle. I know a lot of you, but not all. And before we get into talking about we're going to do it kind of in chronological order, but maybe James can introduce himself before we start talking about the workshop.
I'm James Budinich. I'm a composer. I'm based down in Durham, North Carolina, where I'm a PhD candidate at Duke University.
Yeah, and I'm in New York City, obviously, I guess. So James and I were paired together at the 2018 Next Fest Choreographers and Composers Workshop. And it was really, as Peter said, kind of a one-of-a-kind experience. And I don't know of anything else like that where composers and choreographers are both creating at the same time. Usually you get a piece of music from a composer, maybe you talk about it ahead of time, what you're going to do. But here we spent a lot of time together, first in a conference room. I went into this feeling like I have no idea. It's not like I have some big idea that I want a composer to produce. We're just going to try some stuff out, but I don't know what stuff. So all I had to say to him was, about some things that I had been working on with my improv students and my choreography, just kind of hoping that it would spark something that was of interest to him too. So we spent a lot of time together in a conference room, sort of talking back and forth about our respective processes. We spent time with Peter and with Christopher D'Amboise, the choreographer and dance educator, each sort of giving little seminars. And then the big event was a time in the studio with 4 dancers and I think 8 to 12 string players. And we did have a showing at the end. So even though it was all very exploratory, I knew that we were going to have to, there were going to be people there watching. And so I'm a very slow choreographer, and I knew that I was not going to have what I consider choreography to show at the end of this 10 or so hours that we had with dancers and string players. So what we ended up working on showing were several structured improvisations. And I will say that it was really interesting because the conversations with James in the conference room were very inspiring and interesting, and I would go into it, these studio sessions, thinking, okay, I know what we're going to do now, and then get in there, and the dancers were looking at me, and the string players were looking at James, and we were looking at each other like, wait, what were we going to do? And then the string players would start looking at me, and the dancers would look at him, and there were these terrifying moments where it was like, who's in charge here? Nobody's in charge here. And yet we did come out of it with several things that I think were really interesting and unlike anything either one of us had ever done before, but there were some intense stress moments, I will say, for me anyway, on the way there. And so we wanted to show you a couple of brief clips. We have a bunch of audio visual stuff, so James is going to share his screen and tell you a little bit about some of the, I guess I'll talk first about the hooking game. So there's a game that I had developed in improvisation where a dancer creates a hook on another dancer. I'll try to show it for you. So here's the hook, and then you create a hook on another dancer, and the other dancer has to escape from the hook without destroying it. So without destroying the fingers, and they have to use their center to escape. And so this was something I was playing with dancers, and I just kind of left James on his own with the musicians, because I had no idea what he should tell them to do. So maybe he can explain what they're going to do.
Sure. So for this improvisation, I had each of the string players kind of assigned to a dancer, and you'll see them kind of around the dancers. Each one is looking at a particular dancer. And as a hook is made, as their dancer makes a hook, they play a pitch. And as that hook is released, they move to another pitch. In this final version that you'll see, it's mostly made up of that. In earlier versions, we experimented with the idea of predators and prey. The prey being those who are just attached to dancers. The predators are other string players who are trying to play at the same time as others and make them change their pitch in some way. So kind of attacking through pitch, attacking through bows on the violins.
And I will say that the hooking game got, which is relatively simple with 2 dancers, got very complicated with 4 dancers. So we'll show you a little bit of it. And there are moments of uncertainty, like what do you do if you're hooked in 3 different places? So we'll look at a couple of minutes of this, and hopefully the internet will allow good quality of video. Yeah. I think that's good for that one. Cool. And then the other one that we worked on had to do with Richard Serra's verb list. And this is something that I continue to work with, I find very fruitful. And the artist and sculptor Richard Serra made a list of these actions, verbs, he calls them actions to relate to oneself, material, place, and process. And if you search Richard Serra verbs online, you'll find out this in a number of places. But this is something I've used in different ways in a lot of processes, and you see this in his handwriting here: to roll, to crease, to fold, to store, and then it gets complicated later on, to bend, to weave, and this is actually where the to hook, that was the genesis of to hook. But this is something that Richard Serra would use to experiment on different kinds of material and see how they different materials will respond to the verb to open or to mix or to splash until he arrives at something interesting. And I think I have done a bit of the same in dance. And so we, for this one, we experimented with assigning specific verbs to specific dancers, and that was their role. And we're going to show you a clip where one person's role is to encircle and the other person's role is to bounce, and they have to interact in that way. And we tried, there's a lot of trial and error. I remember some of the other ones that worked nicely were a duet of a dancer whose role was to cut and another one whose role was to smear. And then James can tell you about how that played out for the musicians.
Yeah, so I should say that this kind of process is something that's unusual for me as well. Usually I'm not creating through improvisation. I've done some in the past, but to the extent that we did it at the next festival, this was much more than usual. So I kind of approached it by having a conversation with the musicians. I would give them suggestions based on different verbs here. So I said, well, if we have the verb to encircle, maybe we can encircle around a pitch. You can move your bow in a circular way. Maybe you go all around the violin in different ways, but you're centered around a single pitch. Kind of giving them suggestions, but letting them come up with their own ideas as well. And then kind of curating that to find solutions that worked with the movements that the dancers were doing.
And then there was a thing with the drone too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the other element of this, you can see it in the thumbnail. The musicians are kind of spread around the dancers. We had a kind of spatialization to it. In the beginning, I'm not sure if it's shown in this video, but as a dancer moves down the line, as they get close to musicians, the sound passes through. So as a dancer moves, a musician plays that's close to them, and then the next musician plays. So there's a spatialization to the sound within the room. And at a certain point, we had the violinist play a drone over D, and then play a diatonic melody, kind of folksy melody. And they would move around the room, kind of expanding this spatialization idea. So it really brought the whole studio to life, I think.
Yeah, I think, so the little clip that we're going to see here, it was near the beginning. I think we will see a little bit of the spatialization. And the first dancer who's doing a bit of a solo is, she's enacting the verb to encircle, and then she's going to be joined, there's a bit of a transition. She's going to be joined by the dancer who bounces. And I think that's quite clear. Cool. So after the workshop, there was a, I would say James and I got back in touch maybe in the new year, in the beginning of 2019, and started talking about doing a longer project together. And James, maybe you can talk about some of the movement ideas that you kept thinking about after the workshop and influenced you.
Sure. So thinking back as I was starting to work on the music in the new year, I thought back to our workshop and just the ideas that we kind of worked with. So one idea that I went back to is this idea of found objects. So Richard Serra's verbs are kind of like a found object for us. It's something external that we use in the creation of something new. So I kind of took that and created more sound versions of that. So I used tiles and pipes, and I tried out cookie tins, but that didn't make it into this piece, as creating new instruments and sounds. So I'll play one for you now. This is just tiles. They're kind of a staticky sound that you'll hear. So all of that is just an instrument that's created by me holding two tiles and clicking them together one time. I take that and then kind of process it digitally, and then it becomes a whole new staticky, strange instrument. In this next one, you'll hear pipes, metal pipes as the found source. They're created into many different instruments. In the background, there's this kind of noise that emerges out of it. That's resonance from the pipes that I kind of used feedback to create a more noisy profile. And then another thing that I brought into my composition is the idea as touch between two dancers as the impulse for something new. So in the last one, maybe you noticed one of the dancers kind of moving around the other dancer without touching. But then at the moment where they do touch, it creates a new gesture, a new idea. So I took that into my music, and this sample is going to start with a pipe that hits at a regular rhythmic rate. And then after the noise comes to its climax, it drops out, and then the rate changes. So that dropping out becomes a moment of change. And similarly, I do the same thing at the end of the piece to show you a new, another version of that. So in this one, the rhythms are reacting more to the gong-like sounds. As they hit, the rhythmic rate changes, and then we move on to something new.
Great. So I just, before I say how I worked with the music that James sent me, I would just say that I try to work with found objects, or I try to convince myself that I'm working with found objects as much as possible, because I find it extremely stressful to have to have this vision from scratch in my mind. So I have all these ways that I trick myself into finding objects. And I was just remembering the artist Laurie Anderson had a computer program where you start with a Russian novel. I think it was maybe the Brothers Karamazov, I'm not sure. And then you replace all the names of the characters with your friends' names. And then you replace the places, and then you replace the situations, and you change one thing after another until you have supposedly an original novel. So I kind of tried to do that for myself as much as possible so I can trick myself into creating things. And so in this case, James sent me, I didn't really know what our process was going to be like, but he just sent me like an 18-minute piece of music before we had a chance to talk about anything. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So I didn't have to come up with an idea or anything. So this was, in my case, this was the found object. And I happened to be in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean at the time. And I think the day that I received the music, I was walking by this giant banyan tree, these huge trees with these monstrous roots. And I got very interested in them and started reading about them. And just to try to give you a very abridged version of the life cycle, a bird poops a seed onto the branches of another tree, and this banyan seed, if it germinates, sort of sends its roots twisting around, encircling the host tree, and over decades, eventually strangles that tree and deprives it of resources, and it dies, and you're left with this lattice of roots. And I thought that was a really interesting idea for movement, and also the more I read about these trees, the more complex the life cycle was. And so I made up this whole narrative that James had no intention of when he wrote the music, but that was what it gave me as I was listening to the music. And so we're going to show you a little bit of the work in progress version of this. And we developed another game here, and it had to do with sort of parasitic trees and rescuers. So there's always someone is encircled by this strangling tree, somebody else rescues the victim, and then the victim turns right around and becomes a parasite on their rescuer. So we'll show you a moment of that and how it played out in this trio. So we have Forrest coming to the rescue, rescuing Patrick, who then becomes a parasitic tree on him. Then we have Tiffany executing a beautiful pirouette on her way to rescue Forrest. Who then Patrick rescues Tiffany, and Tiffany winds herself around him. Forrest rescues Patrick. and so on and so forth. Good. So that was a narrative, and oh, okay. So now we're gonna move into notation. And we just wanted to show you the difference between James's system of notation and mine. And this is mine that you see right here. And it is extremely analog, extremely messy. And the bottom, I create these post-it timelines. The bottom ones in yellow are how I've separated the music into little sections according to where I feel it changes. And I write things like chimes, gongs, and modems, or pulse number 1, or climactic pulse, and then airplane. And then up above it, I put my little found objects, actually, the duets and trios and solos I've started to create. And I don't really assign these things to a particular section of the music when we first start creating them. We try them with different parts of the music, and then I create this timeline according to what I feel is working best. And maybe you can show the next one, James. Yeah, this actually would come first in the process. This is me sitting on the subway and listening to the music and writing down timestamps where I think it changes. We have airplane begins slowly at 6:54, and then 7:10, big airplane, and so on. And then James, on the other hand.
So I wrote all of this piece in a software called Ableton Live. So this is totally electronic. These are all just audio tracks that you see that behind the scenes, it has a lot of automation. Things and effects are fading in and out. But this is the first section. It's mostly made up of wind chimes, and that's why it's the same audio file kind of repeated throughout, but processed differently in each version. The second section are more metal pipes. You see these airplane noises down here. That's the airplane that Gabrielle was talking about.
And the airplane is made, James, what was the airplane? What did it consist of, actually?
The airplane is the wind chime resonance being it's like a feedback process. So it just gets louder and louder as I increase the process digitally.
But originally it was a wind chime, and then it sounds like an airplane taking off over the course of 30 seconds or something.
This becomes this incredibly noisy idea. And then this is the final section that's made up of guitar being processed in different ways. And these are viola chords that I made into droning chords that I kind of fade in and out of and choose different pathways.
So after we premiered it was a work in progress premiere at the CUNY Dance Initiative's 5th Year Fest in March, and really enjoyed working on it. The dancers looked great, and felt like I wanted to go further, and I knew that I had at that time already an opportunity the following year, also with CUNY Dance Initiative at the Gerald Lynch Theater in Manhattan. And I had never done a full-length work before, and so I knew I wanted to work with James, and it seemed like, let's expand this thing. It felt like it could go someplace further, and yet I had never done that before. And we had a meeting where we talked about different options. I felt like it was good. The second half should be a negative in some way, an opposite of the first half. And that was about all I knew. And then James.
Yeah, so thinking of that kind of opposite idea from the first half, I kind of consider the first half to be rhythmically and aesthetically loose, and then strict, and then loose again at the end. So we kind of talked about inverting that. So the second half would begin with something that's strict rhythmically, something rigid, and then it would move to something more loose and free, and then return to that strictness at the end. We also talked about introducing new instruments. Like you saw, the first 2 sections were all found objects, and then the third section introduces real instruments, electric guitar and viola. So that felt like a natural progression to continue that, the acoustic instruments in the second half. So you'll see that it begins, or we thought it was going to begin with piano. So piano is introduced in the second half. There's violin and more guitar. And then we also had talked about ideas that we discarded, like using a vocalist that would have a text that's gradually revealed. So at the beginning of the second half, it's a kind of strange, maybe riddle or just syllables that are performed. And then eventually there's a narrative idea or some kind of poetic idea that's verbalized that you can actually understand.
But we didn't do that. Maybe we'll
We
do
did
it
not do
another
that.
time.
Yeah, we had plenty of other material to work with. So we didn't get the chance to work with that idea.
And we knew that we wanted, we talked even then about an interlude, a brief, like a 5-minute-ish interlude between part 1 and part 2 in order to rest the dancers and also to sort of bridge, to create a bridge between these two halves and maybe introduce some of the instruments that would be happening for the first time.
Mhm.
And we decided at that point that we wanted to do a little workshop period in August. And I think I had never had the chance to do something like this before. Well, actually, James was going to talk a little bit about the order of things is that he sent me some audio sketches, so he'll just describe those briefly.
Sure, yeah. So for the workshop, I came up with 3 audio sketches. The first one I came up with is we called it Fast Piano. It's this kind of descending line that's a piano line, and it takes the notes from the guitar in the first half. And that's a very strict rhythmic idea, which is why I thought that we would begin with that. It's just kind of starting with something strict, like we mentioned, and moving to another acoustic instrument. The second idea are these fractured or glitchy chords. That's more free, these kind of flowing synthesizer chords that are interrupted by glitches. So it kind of combines the idea of something free with something maybe more strict with the glitches. And the third idea, which we called Sketch 3, and funnily enough, we just kept calling it Sketch 3. So it's still considered a sketch, but it's part of the final product now. It's this electronic melody over a drone. And it fits more neatly into a kind of traditional meter, like a 4/4, than the other sketches do in Intensible and the other 2 sketches from the workshop. So that was another compliment, kind of finding another way to have something strict or regular with the meter.
So I think a workshop process is really usual for a Broadway show and apparently for an opera, but it's not something that choreographers ever really get to do in contemporary dance, or at least not me. And so I wanted to give myself permission. I knew the premiere wasn't till the following March, and I had a week with these dancers, just 2 hours in the morning every day. And I wanted to give myself permission not to have to create, say, 5 minutes of choreography, but really just to workshop new ideas, which is not something I actually get to do that often. And so we worked with these 3 musical sketches, let improvs build upon other improvs, and yeah, mostly structured improv. So I think we'll show you a few of those, and I can probably just talk over the beginning of this. So we have Patrick and Victoria here. And there's a lot of ideas about constraints here. And so here are circles that are being constrained. She's constraining his circles, and then they have to move to another part of his body. So it just moved to his pelvis. She's gonna go stop the pelvis. And then here we have a wrist constraint. So he's holding her at the wrist, and she's trying to let waves of movement pass through her, but they are having a harder time passing through that one point. It's like a bottleneck. So it moves fluidly through the rest of her, and it can get through, basically, it can get through to the end, but with difficulty. And then we can see how a couple of those ideas really did make it into the show as choreography. And so we can start this one and expanded to include more dancers. And then here comes the wrist constraint. And every day I was sending James reports and videos describing what we were doing. And he picked up particularly on this wrist constraint idea and how we were responding to the glitchiness of the music. And he took it someplace that I had, that was very surprising for me.
Mhm. Yeah, so um, to play you first the original file, I'll play a little bit of that so you hear that first. This is from the August workshop. So you hear the kind of chords being interrupted by the glitches. And that was something that I thought worked really well, both musically and in dance. And it worked out that I had another project that I was going to write for my friend Kate Dreyfus, who's on this call, a great violinist. Um, and I liked the chords so much that I wanted to combine them with something new. And I thought this is the perfect opportunity to kind of add in a violin and really embrace this idea of a grid that kind of make it more strict rhythmically, timbrally, aesthetically. So the electronics changed just a little bit. I'll play that for you. You'll hear a little bit of a difference in the sound. And then I combined that with the violin, which is going to play regular notes, very continuous 8th and 16th notes. And then I add in another electronic layer. So to hear them all put together. So you hear that the regular notes kind of, for me, become a grid. It's this continuous pulse that's made. But then with the trills, the glitches, it's ways to play against the grid, to kind of alter it in slight ways so that it keeps its interest, kind of can become something more developmental across time. And
In
this
the
idea,
same way that the dancers were constraining each other.
exactly. Mhm. Yeah. So this idea is also influenced by the artist Agnes Martin for me. So here you see a white flower. It's this kind of, they're very small grids that are made over the canvas. It's like a very meditative, immersive art form. Another one that maybe is easier to see is Summer 1964. There's dots within the grid over the blue background. And then the piece that I chose to borrow the title from is Whitestone. It's hard to tell here because it's such a minute grid, but that is indeed a grid in the background and not just something textural. So the idea of creating something so regular, but then messing with it in a way to keep it different and more developmental.
Yeah, and James and I had conversations about this, and I was pretty surprised, having listened to Whitestone, to hear him describe it as a grid. It wasn't how I thought of a grid, and I ended up, through my movement experiments, deciding to put the most circular movement in the whole piece here. So this whole 10-minute movement, which ends the piece, is all about circles, and we'll show you a very brief little excerpt here. Mm-hmm. And I will say also, interestingly, Whitestone, although it was the dancers loved dancing to it. It was very, very easy. Actually, in a lot of James's music so far, it's been very easy for the dancers to get lost because it lacks regularity and the downbeats are not where they expect them to be. So it required a lot of rehearsal.
Mhm. Yeah, those are ideas that I like to play a lot with my music, which I guess don't work with the traditional dance ideas, but they pulled it off really well.
They did, they did.
And to talk back about fast piano, to show the development of this from the workshop to the final version, here's the opening from the workshop. So you hear the descending piano line there that's continually repeated, and there's those electronic processes happening in the background to distort it. We tried some different versions as we developed it after August, but we ended up actually keeping it very close to the original.
I think that was because I requested that. I did it.
Yeah, I think so. We tried a couple different things, but this worked really well. There were some small changes. The background gets a bit more busy. You'll hear more of those electronic lines kind of glissandoing around in the background. And the bass hits are more prominent, kind of louder. So I'll play that for you now. Really very similar to the original workshop version, but more refined after time.
And this was the, oh, yeah, go on, James, go ahead.
Oh, sure. And then I just want to show the connection to the guitar line from Tensible here. So those four notes that pop out, the higher notes, that's fast piano. It's just those four notes over and over again. And it's totally different in this new context with it being continually repeated, continually distorted. But there is a melodic parallel from the first movement there as we move into this new instrument, this new timbre. And then I'll show quickly one of the cut fast pianos. I tried making it more distorted, which I think kind of bumped up the anxiety that Gabrielle and the dancers were feeling with it.
Yeah.
So we ended up cutting this one. So it's the same exact idea, but the processes are more amplified.
And fast piano, I will say, was the one that did give me the most anxiety from the workshop, probably maybe through the end of the process. It was not, I mean, it's a totally inhuman piano, obviously. And so it was hard to imagine movement that could possibly match it. And I gave up on trying to match it with speed. And instead, I don't have a video of it, but I chose my most intense dancer and tried to match the intensity of it rather than the speed. Mm-hmm. And James also had, in his original concept had been to start the whole piece with fast piano, but I had a lot of anxiety about that. Like, how are we possibly going to open the curtain with that? Also, because I didn't feel like I was yet able to match it. So mm-hmm. Instead, we open with
filtered chords. So this kind of continues the idea of found objects from the first half, but in a new context. I took a few chords from Beethoven's Heiliger Dankgesang from his Opus 132 string quartet, and I put them into a synthesizer. You'll hear that it's just a normal synthesizer. My piano playing is not great, but it's fine. So I took that and looped it and let Ableton record using this thing called a harmonizer. It adds new pitches in. It adds in a delay effect. So A single note is then played multiple times at different pitches, so it kind of creates more of a wash texture. So I let it record for 5 or 6 minutes, I think, to just generate more material for me out of those few chords. So then the first step was to get this. So you can hear the attacks of the chord still. It's still visible. It's still audible. In the next process, I use beat repeat, which chooses different areas to repeat different beats. So I set a rhythmic profile, and then it just follows that. And there's a chance that it might happen or it might not. And I used one version of this that muffles the original signal. So the original signal is lost even more. And you'll hear it's starting to get more distanced from Beethoven now. And there's still some pitch audible in there. And I chose to amplify certain overtones. So you'll hear 2 different profiles here, changing the pitch more. And this is the filtered part of filtered chords. These chords are now put into different filters, amplifying those overtones. And then when you pitch it down an octave, it makes it twice as long as well. So that changes it. And it's that kind of regular rhythmic rate. And then when it's all put together, Beethoven is somewhere in the background, but mostly lost at this point, I think. So that's an idea that we've been working with since the next festival that kind of continued and found new versions of itself.
And we did end up opening the piece. We're not really going in order here at all, but we ended up opening the piece with filtered chords, and that did conform to James's idea of starting with something strict and moving to something loose. And I think, as we discussed, sketch 3, James, would you say that's the loose on the looser end? Is that right?
I think of it more on the strict end. It's kind of
okay.
A little bit more on the strict end.
So anyway, sketch 3, which remained from the workshop, was our absolute favorite to work with in the workshop. And throughout the whole process, everything ended up looking good to sketch 3. Could have had it be much longer. And yeah, and so James said that he thought that this would be the one to get cut of anything, but it was our favorite from the beginning. And it was also kind of easy to get lost in this one, however, but we had these little landmarks that we called splashes, and I will show you just a little bit of the of Cody's solo with the splashes. Splash. And even though we loved working with this piece of music, we still did get lost, and it actually became a problem towards the end of it that the dancers didn't know, because they were focusing on their dancing, they didn't really know when the next track was going to begin. And so you know, 2 days, one day before the show, I would have to ask James, who was sitting there in the audience at the theater, do you think you could add another 2 splashes here, and then maybe a little warning signal to the dancers, like make this splash a little bit different so they know they need to get off the stage in the next 4 minutes, in the next 4 seconds. And I think we were just, I think we can like cut the talk about the interlude maybe and leave time for some questions, because we're, yeah. So if you have questions, please do write them in the chat. And yeah, let's see if there's anything else. I mean, I suppose
this is just so great, and I feel so I always feel so proud that we sort of introduced you through our next festival, speed dating, and that it really went somewhere. You know, Gabriella, I'm interested in, you were talking about the stress that you felt of having people waiting for you to come up with something. How did you work through that, or what? Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
I mean, just knowing that there was a showing, to be honest. I mean, I always feel that to some degree as a choreographer, but somehow there was this, like, there was also James looking at me, in addition to all the dancers, James looking at me and being like, wait, what did we talk about in the conference room? And so it's like, you got to do something. And so just like try something. There's a bit of a feeling of desperation, but then you start to get curious about something. So I think the curiosity is what saves you and distracts you from the stress.
Great. So we have a couple questions coming in. One is gorgeous lighting. What space is this performed in?
This was the Gerald W. Lynch Theater at John Jay College, and the lighting designer is Barry Steele. He did an incredible job with very little time, and yeah, he did a super beautiful job.
Great. Another question is, very cool and interesting material for collaboration here. Thank you for sharing your process with us. In total, how long was this process from start or workshop to finish?
Say February 2019 through February 2020. Well, workshop, yeah, for this particular project, yeah.
And James, can you speak more about Ableton Live? I have been arranging and composing a bit and have been looking into different software. I've been asking different composers about their experiences with different software.
Yeah, I'm relatively new to Ableton Live. I started with it in fall 2018, I think. I had experience with Logic before that and other audio software. But for me, Ableton is so much more intuitive. It's so much more natural, I think, to work with sound and sculpt it within the software that I think it just, to me, it makes a lot of sense composer-wise and arranging-wise.
Great. And another question, awesome work. Can you talk a little bit more about how your two ideas of found object overlapped or differed?
Well,
I feel like we kind of went in two different directions with that idea.
yeah, I think we did too. For me, the found objects are always little bits of, like little sections of the dance, like a solo or a duet, or like I take 2 solos as found objects and then combine them. And I think of it kind of like building a stone wall. Like you find the stones and then you fit them together in the way that is the best for the whole structure. I don't know if that really answers the questions. Maybe James could answer and I'll think some more.
Sure. For me, it kind of had this more literal connotation. I used actual objects to create sounds through Ableton Sampler and making other instruments. And then I kind of expanded that to the idea of quotation of musical material. So it's kind of existing sound that I then distort. But the kernel, the source of the idea, is something external to me, something different.
Mm-hmm. I would say with me, for example, I might have, you know, I would teach the dancers a phrase of movement, and then I might apply the idea of hooking. So I have 2 different found objects. So one dancer is doing this predetermined phrase, another one creates a hook. And it's like, I haven't planned where the hook is going to happen. It's up to the dancers to like, oh, I can hook then. And that's how, yeah, that's how I find surprise in the work. That's just one really simple example, but leaving a certain amount of it up to the dancers probably to make choices. And then I choose between options.
Great. Another question. The basic problem of dance to unmetered music was dealt with by Cunningham and Cage by having the dancers learn the piece by memory and then have the whole piece played only during the staged performance. Would you ever want to try that?
Maybe. I think it can, you know, different kinds of music I found, even like, for example, when I was working with different movements of the same Bach suite for cello, I found like I could get away with a very improvised adagio saraband movement. There were a lot of possible right musicalities. So I let the dancers just have only landmarks for that one, an improvised musicality, whereas another piece, a jig, I think it was it just had to be much more set, much more precise. So maybe I'm going in that direction, I don't know, but I will say that with the very beginning of the piece, the first 5 minutes of the original Tensible, the dancers, it was so hard for them to find their way through the music that the ultimate solution was a stopwatch. Like when we did it without a stage manager, they had to start their phones at the same time as the music, and they just knew I have to enter at 3:24. And when there was a stage manager, the stage manager would call the entrance, but it was causing them too much stress to try to keep track of the modems and the gongs.
Great. Another question. I wish I knew this before I saw the performance. Are you thinking of expanding this? When are you going to show this work, if you have any plan?
We would love to do it again. We're looking for opportunities. Yeah, it would, because the full version, I mean, Act 1, the first half got a number of performances, but the whole thing only got that one performance in February. So if anyone has any ideas, or if there are any presenters here, we're all ears.
Great. One other question. James, what drew you to use the chords from the Heilige Dankesang as the seed for some of the musical material for this piece?
Usually when I think of quotations that I want to borrow, it's just things that I've been listening to or things that I like. For this one, I just really like this string quartet. And when you get to this movement in Opus 132, the opening is this kind of oasis of sound where everything is so open and like kind of majestic, but in a very concise way maybe. So I wanted to take that and just kind of repeat it and see what I could get out of it. I also did the whole found quotation idea with the Whitestone chords too, but it's much less noticeable. I took audio from an early music chant recording and then processed it digitally. Took the audio, made it into MIDI, an electronic music file, and then repitched and like reworked the chords that came out of that to become the chords that I used in Whitestone. So it's just kind of things that I've been listening to or things that I like.
Super cool piece. Really like the glitchy chords. Along the lines of Anna's question, looking into different softwares and wondering if you can elaborate more on what makes Ableton intuitive and your software of choice. Perhaps if there are moments from the process of this project that stick out. Thanks for your time putting on this presentation.
Sure. So with Ableton, they have a number of stock plugins that are really useful, and you can easily kind of combine them and find ways to kind of change the sound your own way. So creating these chains of effects in Ableton is really easy. Creating automation to alter those effects through time is really easy and interesting. And then they also have the live element where you can create loops and samples and things like that to kind of create a live set. I use that one less. I've used Ableton more in this kind of setting where I'm writing a piece and it's kind of left to right laid out. But there's a lot of possibilities within the software. Yeah.
Here's a question that's particularly close to my heart as a composer and somebody who is a collider of live collaborators. Gabrielle, what did you like about working in collaboration with a composer rather than using music already composed, even by a living composer?
I like the conversation, the dialogue back and forth, and how it obviously I don't like to make choices, but it's another way that I can trick myself into not having to make all the choices myself. It's a little bit strange to be a choreographer whose job is to make choices all day long and not to like to make choices, but I guess I do at some level, but somehow sharing the decisions or being able to have a conversation with somebody else about those decisions and decide things together is nice, because otherwise you're just all alone there at the top of the pyramid, and it's a lonely place to be, and also it's not as possible to surprise yourself. I feel like yeah, I've been more challenged in good ways by sharing that position, instead of like me getting into my habits, my patterns, my same choices. Yeah, I would say that.
Great. Well, thanks so much to both of you. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody who tuned in. Thanks to the NYU Center for Ballet and the Arts for being a wonderful host for us for this festival for many, many years now. And to Alisa Alpine and the CUNY Dance Initiative for bringing this all to life in such a great commission. I'm so excited about that. We are here to provide free resources to our artists and our audiences. And so we would be very, very happy if you're interested in making a contribution of any size. I've sent you a link also in the comments. These are tax-deductible contributions, and they let us bring you free events like this. We're here for the duration. Please do join us every Tuesday and Thursday. We have lots of musical events and master classes, and we will be moving into more choreographic and collaborative works as well. So please do tune in. Thanks for joining us. Thanks again to James and Gabrielle, and take care, everybody. Stay creative, stay safe.
Thanks for having us. Thanks everybody for coming, and feel
Thanks,
free
everyone.
to write with any other questions. Contact info is online.
Yep, my email's on my website as well.